Hi, I'm Dr. Tom Stovicek with the Defense Language Institute Foreign Language Center. Today we're going to be talking about the fundamentals of interpreting. Before we get started, the contents of this presentation are not necessarily the official views of the Defense Language Institute Foreign Language Center, nor are they endorsed by the Department of the Army, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. The content of this presentation is my sole responsibility. So you're probably watching this video because you've been asked to do some interpreting. And you may be feeling a little nervous or apprehensive about the mission, especially if this is your first time working in an interpreting scenario. It's true that many professional interpreters have advanced specialized degrees in interpreting, and you may not be there just yet, but this presentation is going to lead you through some tips and suggestions from professional and experienced interpreters that are going to help you know what to do to feel prepared and confident as you go into this mission. So if you've seen interpreters work, sometimes it can look like it's a very easy job. But actually, the interpreters that make it look easy are the ones that have done their homework and their preparation before the assignment. And this is the part of interpreting that we often don't see or appreciate. So one of the things that you want to keep in mind as you're getting prepared to go into an interpreting mission is what's the setting that you're going to be working in. Let's consider two different settings here. On the left, you can see an image of a conference. So conference interpretation entails a number of things. If you think about conferences, what's going on? There are going to be a number of speakers throughout the day. They're going to have prepared presentations. And as an interpreter, you may be interpreting for several of them throughout the day. And this is a formal setting. So some of the considerations you may want to make are, can you get copies of the presentation in advance, or at least an abstract of those? Are you knowledgeable about the subject matter of the conference? If you don't feel very knowledgeable about it, that's something you're going to want to research in both languages that you're going to be working in, because there are going to be specialized terms, specialized vocabulary, and it's a special context that you're going to want to make sure you're familiar with in both languages before you go into that scenario. And if you can get copies of the presentation notes or presentation slides, or even talk to the presenters in advance, you're going to be that much more prepared to go into that scenario. On the right side, we can see an illustration of escort interpretation. Escort interpretation is very different from conference interpretation. In this case, normally you're going to be working with one principal, one client that you're going to be accompanying or escorting throughout a trip or throughout a mission, throughout an event. You're going to follow them around and you're going to be interpreting for them in a variety of scenarios. And these scenarios can range from very informal to very formal within the same day. You may be helping that person order food or arrange transportation, and you may also be interpreting for them in high-level, high-stakes formal meetings. So you should be aware of what you're getting into so you can best prepare yourself for the kind of interpreting you'll be doing. So there are different modes of interpreting that you should be aware of. And here I'm going to discuss three of them with you. So the first one I want to talk about is simultaneous interpreting. Simultaneous interpreting often happens with the interpreter working inside a specially designed interpretation booth, as you can see here in the illustration. And in simultaneous interpretation, specialized equipment is used that allows the interpreter to hear what is being spoken and speak into a microphone so that the listener can hear through a speaker or an earpiece without the interpreter being in the room or in close proximity to the speaker or the listener. There's also equipment for simultaneous interpretation that's more portable, that may be used in like a tour scenario where the group of people is moving around, and there may be interpreters working in different languages for different members of that group. But typically when we think of simultaneous interpretation, it's a booth type situation like we can see here. Whisper interpretation was illustrated in the middle. It's a version of simultaneous interpretation. But the difference is that the specialized equipment is not typically used here. What happens instead is that the interpreter is going to sit in very close proximity to the principal and literally whisper into his or her ear or just speak softly so that only that person can really hear what the interpreter is saying. But in both simultaneous and whisper interpretation, the interpreter is listening and speaking, interpreting all at the same time. That's why it's referred to as simultaneous, because there's no pause. And many people feel that this is one of the most difficult modes of interpreting to work in. Consecutive interpreting, which we can see illustrated on the right side of the slide, is a little bit more common for use in the field. And in consecutive interpretation, the speakers are going to take turns speaking. They're going to pause in their speech so that the interpreter can interpret for each of them while the speaker is no longer speaking. It's during the pause. So this is a little bit less taxing cognitively for the interpreter. And it's very useful in one-on-one conversations like you can see here, where you have two interlocutors conversing with each other eye to eye, and the interpreter is taking advantage of those pauses to communicate back and forth in both the source language and the target language. So because the consecutive interpreting is so commonly used, many of the tips and suggestions that we're going to cover here have in mind that you're most likely going to be working in a consecutive interpreting scenario. So direction of interpreting, what's meant by this is that although it's very common that an interpreter is going to be listening to and speaking in two languages in the role of interpreter, but there are times when an interpreter may only work in one direction, which means that the interpreter is listening to a source language and interpreting into a target language, but not working the other way. This sometimes occurs when there are two parties interacting and each party has their own interpreter. So there is only a need for each interpreter to interpret in one direction. And sometimes then it can occur if the interpreter is very skilled at listening to and understanding a source language, but doesn't have an equal or a nearly equal skill to be able to speak in that language, in which case they may be very well prepared to interpret in one direction with that language pair, but not necessarily in the other direction. So this is something to keep in mind. If you get asked to do interpreting and you don't feel that your speaking strength or your speaking proficiency is equal in both of those languages, you may want to make it known that you feel comfortable doing interpreting in one direction, but you don't feel comfortable or qualified to do bidirectional interpreting. That's a judgment call you'll have to make if you're asked or called upon to do interpreting, but it's something to keep in mind. But most of the time, you should expect, if you get asked to do interpreting, unless otherwise specified, that you're going to be working in a bidirectional interpreting scenario where you're both listening to and speaking in both languages. Positioning is another important consideration for interpreters. Here we can see two different scenarios. On the left, the interpreter is physically located between the two parties who are speaking to each other. They're able to maintain good eye contact with each other. As an interpreter, you want to avoid having the speakers turn their head and look to you, the interpreter, when they're speaking to each other. Your role is to help them communicate with each other, not for them to communicate to you. And depending on what the situation is, how you position yourself will make a difference. I can't tell you which is best because I don't know what scenario you're going to be working in. But consider these two scenarios as possibilities as you decide what's going to work best in the scenario that you will find yourself in. If we look at the other example here, we can see that the interpreter is to the side and maybe slightly behind one party. What difference do you see in these two? Comparing the two, in which one does the interpreter have a more neutral role, and in which one may the interpreter appear or be more on the side of helping one party versus the other party. These are just things to consider. Other considerations you might want to make are the actual spacing. How much space is there? Are there chairs that can't be moved? There may be security concerns with respect to where people are positioned. Or you may have to consider whether or not you're the only interpreter working, or maybe there's another interpreter working for the other party. And all of those things are important considerations when you decide how you're going to position yourself with respect to the speakers. Another good idea is to establish at the beginning clear hand signals. You don't necessarily want to use the timeout signal illustrated here, but you may want to come up with one that you feel is culturally appropriate for both parties involved. Maybe you want to just hold up a hand or raise a finger to indicate you need a minute. This signal would indicate that there's a need for a pause. And the reason that's important is because as an interpreter, you don't want to interrupt the conversation. But especially if you're working with individuals who are not familiar and practiced with working with an interpreter in a consecutive interpreting scenario, they may not be conscious of how essential it is that they pause frequently enough for the interpreter to catch up with what's being said. So as an interpreter, you're going to have a sense of how much information you can hold in your short-term memory before you need to pause and convert that into the target language. And so if you can signal without interrupting a signal that's pre-established that everybody will understand, that'll give the message that, oh, oops, you're speaking a little bit too much before I can catch up. Can you please pause so I can interpret and then we can proceed. So getting back to the topic of preparation, it's important, as I mentioned, to understand as much as you can about the scenario that you're going to be working in before the interpreting starts. So many times you're going to be asked to interpret in a very specific, specialized scenario, whether it's a conference or an operation or something in between. There's likely going to be some specialized subject matter discussed. It may be something related to cybersecurity, or it may be something related to medical operations, public health, civil affairs, legal matters. Whatever it is, all of those fields have their own specialized vocabulary. There may be other special conventions for speaking in those fields. And if that's not your area of expertise, it's definitely something you want to learn as much as you can about in preparation for interpreting. So you may, if you can get read-ahead materials from the individuals you're going to be working with, copies of slides, copies of notes, if you can get briefed, all of these things will help you. If you want to do some research on your own in both languages, make sure you're familiar with the most commonly used jargon, the most commonly used technical vocabulary, any acronyms that are commonly used that the principal communicators in this event may not need to explain to each other, but they may be totally unfamiliar to you as the interpreter. So if you can learn those and study them in advance, maybe create your own glossary with those specialized words and terms that aren't so familiar to you, then you'll be ready to tackle them when you encounter them in the interpreting scenario. The more you can anticipate what's going to be discussed, the better. You can rehearse in your mind some of the things you think you may have to interpret, and that'll help you feel more prepared. And then another tip from experienced interpreters is you want to practice listening to the language variety that you're going to be using. Languages have accents, they have dialects, they have regional variants, and you may be very familiar with one, maybe more than one, but you may get asked to interpret in a scenario where one of the varieties that you're most familiar with is not the main one that you're going to be listening to. So you may want to take some time to listen to podcasts or other media produced in the variety of language that you're going to be working with. This is going to help you get used to listening to that pronunciation, that accent, the idiosyncrasies of language structure or terminology that are used in that region or by that population. And listening to things that are current may also help you develop your broader socio-political understanding of what's going on, so that you can understand cultural references that may be unfamiliar to you in this scenario. Taking notes is another important aspect of consecutive interpretation. And there are certainly a lot of tips and suggestions and courses out there for learning how to take notes effectively for consecutive interpreting. And we can't cover all of those here, but a few highlights for you to be aware of. Of course, it's a good idea anytime you're going to be asked to do some interpreting to carry a notepad and at least 2 good pens that are reliable. Maybe some pencils if you prefer, but have a good, reliable writing instrument and a notepad that allows you to flip back and forth easily between the pages so you can refer back to notes you took earlier. Many interpreters recommend a notepad like the one you see here that has the spiral across the top, because it allows you to hold it in one hand and flip back and forth between the pages more easily than if the spiral runs down the side. Taking notes for interpreting is an art form because it can be very easy to get hung up on trying to write down everything, and that's not going to work for you. You're going to fall behind in your listening because you can't write as fast as you can listen, and you can't write as fast as someone can speak. So you really need to develop a strategy for writing as little as possible to capture as much of the meaning that you need to write down that you won't be able to hold in your short-term memory. So some suggestions are develop a set of symbols or a shorthand that's consistent that you're always going to understand, but that can be written very quickly. Some interpreters suggest using the space on the page in a way that helps them organize the flow of thoughts. You'll want to develop your own system for this because there's no one correct way of doing it. But you are going to want to focus when you take notes on key facts, details, things that are hard to remember, names, dates, statistics, anything that you know in your own mind is hard to remember in a conversation. Those are the things you want to write down, because when you get to that pause, you don't want to realize that you forgot all those numbers you just heard and you can't recall them when you have to convert the message into the target language. And of course, taking notes is another aspect of interpreting that the more you practice it, the more natural it's going to feel and the more effective it's going to be for you as a tool. Another important consideration in interpreting, there are going to be times, even when you've done your homework, you've done your preparation, you've created your glossary, there are going to be times that a word or a concept comes up in the interaction that's just not familiar to you, and you just can't find the perfect right word to translate that. You should be prepared for this to happen. And when it does, if you find yourself looking for the right word, what you want to do is find a way to explain the concept in more words, because there may not be one perfect word for it. And even if there is, you may not know it, or it may not be jumping to the front of your mind where you can grab it. So you'll want to explain the concept, or talk around it in a way that the idea gets across, even though you may not find that perfect word or phrase that you're looking for as the best equivalent in the target language. You want to make sure that you're focusing on the intent that the speaker is trying to get across, and you're not getting too hung up on those individual words. That's something that if you're doing written translation, you may have the luxury of time to be able to look those up and find just the perfect translation. But when you're doing interpreting, you're not going to have that luxury. And as much as you may want to, you're going to have to talk around it and move on. And you may also have to summarize at times, because in order to keep the pace of the conversation, There may be times when a very lengthy or wordy idea is expressed, and it can be expressed in fewer words, in a more direct way that'll keep the conversation flowing. And if you're still able to maintain the intent of what's being said, it's going to help the interaction flow better. It's another decision that you'll have to make as you're doing interpreting. So ask for clarification. It may feel uncomfortable, especially if you're not expecting to find yourself in this position, but keep in mind that it's okay. There are going to be times, no matter how prepared you are, that something comes up and you're not quite sure you understood exactly what the speaker meant by that. And it's okay to ask for clarification in that situation. But you want to keep in mind that since you as interpreter are speaking in first person, relaying the messages back and forth between the primary speakers, you want to clarify that it's you as the interpreter who's asking for clarification. And so there are different ways you can do this, but you might just say in third person now, the interpreter requests clarification on X, Y, or Z. Or you may say, as interpreter, I need to request clarification on the meaning of whatever the term, phrase, acronym may be. And then once it's clarified, you can proceed with your interpreting and move on. And that way, there's no confusion about who didn't understand. And things can continue to flow. I want to talk a little bit about neutrality. Neutrality in interpreting is an important concept. Many times the role of the interpreter is referred to as the conduit role, meaning that basically the job of the interpreter is to remain neutral and for the information to flow back and forth between the primary speakers in an unaltered form through the medium of the interpreter without anything getting altered. And that's generally expressed as the ideal for interpreters. The interpreter is often, ideal interpreter is often described as being invisible to the interaction. If they're doing their job very well, the principal communicators may almost forget that the interpreter is there in theory. But I remember a workshop that I was giving where one of my military participants pointed out to me that if you're wearing a U.S. military uniform representing the U.S. government as the only interpreter in a bilateral conversation, the illusion that you're totally neutral there may just not exist. And in fact, the reality may be that you're not entirely neutral, because if you understand what the intent is and your role there as a representative of the U.S. government is to facilitate U.S. interests in this interaction, you may play a role in providing cultural advice. And this may sometimes even take the form of avoiding cultural faux pas that may be detrimental to the interaction. That's a careful judgment call that you have to make as the interpreter, and it's something that's probably best discussed before the interpreting begins so that everybody's on the clear page with each other about what exactly the role is. If somebody makes a slip or a mistake or says something that may be slightly offensive, are you expected as the interpreter to kind of clean that up for the sake of maintaining the intent of the interaction? Or really, as an interpreter, are you supposed to be completely neutral and express all those things exactly the way they were originally stated? That's a careful judgment call, but it's one that I think it's important to keep in mind. However, it's also important that as interpreter, you check your own biases, because you don't want to insert your own bias into anything that you're interpreting. You may disagree slightly or have a different perspective on something that's said, but your job really as the interpreter is to not affect the outcome of the conversation. It's really just to facilitate it. So you don't necessarily have to take responsibility for those things. If you don't feel totally comfortable with it, if you don't agree with it, that's not your role as interpreter. Your role as interpreter is to be on the side, not making eye contact with the speakers. They're speaking to each other, and you're there just to get the message across. So it's another decision and judgment call that you have to make. As an interpreter, I can't tell you exactly what to do, but it's one of those very important considerations that you should keep in mind. And I want to remind you also, be kind to yourself. Interpreting can be a very tough job. It can be physically and mentally exhausting. Making a lot of high-stakes decisions can occur in some of these interactions. And if you're not taking care of yourself, if you're not aware of what you need to do your best and you're not sharing that information with the others that you're working with, you can potentially set yourself up to not do your best. But you want to make sure that you're aware. You may not be a professional interpreter yet. You may not have as much training yet as you would like to, but you're going to do the best that you can. You're going to prepare. You're going to accept the fact that you'll probably make mistakes that you have to correct. That's okay. It's part of the job. It happens. Be kind to yourself. Forgive yourself for those mistakes. Correct them. Move on. Communicating your needs, some of the things you'll want to keep in mind. And you may not be able to get everything that you need, but the more you are aware of what you need and communicate those needs, the more likely you are to have everything at your disposal to do your very best. So stay hydrated. Keep water nearby. You may need to take a drink every once in a while. You're going to be doing a lot of talking, which means you're going to be losing water through your breath. And if your mouth is dry and you're getting heat exhaustion, you can't interpret at your best. We don't want that to happen. So take care of hydration. If you can, make sure you take breaks. If you haven't done interpreting before, you may not realize how exhausting it can be. If there's another interpreter that can help you, it's recommended that you take turns with each other. Maybe every 20 or 30 minutes, switch out. You can both be there to make sure you're both listening and engaged in what's going on and you understand the context, but just having that kind of mental break for 20 minutes where you're passively listening and understanding but not actively interpreting, you're going to do that much better of a job when you jump back in when it's your partner's turn to take a break. It may not be possible, but if you don't express the benefits of doing that, you're less likely to have a partner available to work with. So interpreting can be a really exciting and rewarding experience. Yes, it can be a little nerve-wracking, but hopefully if you follow these tips and suggestions, do your preparation, you're going to feel confident and prepared to go into this, and you're going to do a great job with it. Okay. I want to recognize the two primary works that I consulted to put this talk together, and thank the authors for publishing and sharing their expertise on this. And I also want to give a special thanks to the two outstanding LEAP scholars and airmen who took time out of their day to share their expertise and experience with interpreting with me. Thank you so much, and thank you for listening.